I am Valérie Arnoult, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Africa program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our meeting today on a crisis of governance, xenophobic violence in South Africa. Now, as all of you know, South Africa, unfortunately, like many other countries, has a long history of dealing with xenophobic violence towards foreigners, and in particular towards African and Asian foreigners. Now, in March 2019, the government adopted a national action plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. However, this so far does not seem to have really changed the situation on the ground that much. And there hasn't been a significant reduction in xenophobic incidents in the country. Now, these xenophobic incidents or xenophobic violence can take on many forms. Most of the time here in Europe, we hear about it when there are large-scale outbreaks of violence and attacks against individuals. However, xenophobic violence is a day-to-day reality in South Africa. It also manifests through discrimination in access to service and justice, in physical attacks against individuals or looting of property and businesses, harassment by police forces, administrative harassment, difficulties of renewing papers, etc. There's a lot of debate about what exactly is driving this violence in South Africa, with some arguing that this is not xenophobic violence, but that it is more driven by economic factors, by frustrations about lack of employment, discrimination in the workforce, and a lack of investment of the government in delivery services. Now, to help shed us some light on the situation in South Africa and what exactly is driving this xenophobic violence, I am very pleased to welcome our speaker today, Loren Landau, who is a professor of migration and development at the University of Oxford. And he's also a South African research chair in human mobility and the politics of difference at the University of the Witwatersrand African Center for Migration and Society. And he is also a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He is a renowned expert on human mobility, xenophobia, inclusion, and representation. And at the moment, he's working on a project where he explores mobility, temporality, and urban politics in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. I will drop later on some links in the chat box below to some of his publications. In his presentation today, Professor Landau will discuss how the current anti-immigration mobilization is linked to a transformation in politics, or transforming politics in South Africa and transforming modes of governance. As usual, our speaker will talk for about half an hour, after which we will have a session of discussion with the public. I would ask that you drop your questions either in the chat box below or in the Q&A box below. You can do so while he's giving his presentation or afterwards as well. And I will then share these questions raised by you to Professor Landau. So on this, I give the floor to you now. Your microphone is off.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you all for spending a bit of your day with me. Let me just get this up. I hope that's visible to everybody. So I'm going to speak, as you heard, for about half an hour. I hope maybe even a little bit less, but to try to reflect a little bit on what is not just a crisis of human rights and violence and crime, but I think speaks to something more fundamental about South Africa, South Africa's future, the nature of its society, but particularly the way it is governed and the way in which we think about intervening and engaging with the spaces where most South Africans live, and indeed where most migrants live. So I'm going to take you through kind of three stages in the next few minutes. The first is just to provide a little bit of background. Those of you who know South Africa will know about its history. Going back, of course, hundreds of years, migration has been a major part of South Africa's building through the mines, through other things. But in recent years, looking at migration both into the country and within the country to try to understand how it is reshaping the society. I'll then step back and talk more explicitly about today's subject, which is how exclusion has manifested itself primarily in the forms of violent exclusion. So of course there's, as Valerie has said, there is discrimination at all levels and in many different kinds of places. It is fair to say that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of immigrants live relatively peacefully with South Africans as their neighbors without massive problems, but there are also problems that manifest themselves in violence. I then want to get at some of why we think what is going on, what's going on, what are the explanations, how do we make sense of it, not just in terms of explaining the violence, but also really thinking about what it means for South Africa and its future. So that's where I'll end. Of course, this is part of a kind of evolving process. Politics is dynamic. Migration, by definition, is dynamic. And the violence is itself transformatory. So what comes next, who knows? But hopefully this will give you an insight into that. The main message here is, as I suggested, that what we're seeing is not just a kind of anti-immigrant politics. That's part of it. Some of it is a little bit like what we've seen in the US over the last 4 years and what we're seeing in parts of Europe now. But really that we need to think about it as part of South Africa's second transition from apartheid and the way in which citizens 20 years or so or more after the end of apartheid are reasserting themselves and trying to make certain claims on the government, trying to make certain claims on the space and on the economy, and doing so in ways that are often violently exclusive. They're also doing so in ways that are often very localized. So even though they use the language of nationality, to really understand this, we need to understand local politics and particularly township politics. So before I go any further, I want to just give you a little bit of what in the US they call a trigger warning. This is a presentation fundamentally about violence, and it's about what might be considered very performative violence, violence that is done to be seen in front of media cameras, in front of politicians, and in front of us. And I've included images, all taken from South African media or the BBC. They have already been published, they're already out there, but it is perhaps not the most ideal lunchtime viewing, but I'll pass through them quickly and I hope it won't disturb anybody, but I just wanted to flag that before we go any further. So let me begin by just saying that the research that I'm presenting here is coming out of almost 20 years of research on migration and xenophobia in South Africa. We started doing this work in sort of 2005, which I guess is only 15 years, when we started noticing what seemed to be increasing attacks on foreigners. And this has produced a number of academic texts, but also helped us develop a sort of platform, XenoWatch, which is really meant to track this at a very micro level, each incident verified, spatialized, and in many instances where we go and explore and try to find out exactly what's happening. And that initiative is crowdsourced. You can go and look at it online if you're interested. There's much more information than I can present you here. And that initiative is directed by my colleague, Jean-Pierre Misago, who has worked with me very closely on a lot of the research that I'm going to present to you today. So let me go back again and just talk about the kind of context. I know many of you will know South Africa quite well, so this might be a review, but it is a way of just foregrounding some of the social dynamics that are going on. What you can see here, and this is not the most recent map, but it reflects many of the trends of migration within Africa. As you can see, this is focused on migration within the continent. We often see maps of Africa with arrows pointing north towards Europe. That's important, of course, but most African migrants who move do so within Africa. Cote d'Ivoire being the #1 destination for many years, and now really South Africa being the #1 destination for migrants, international migrants. That said, it has a much longer history of migration, and the whole social structure, of course, has been shaped by migration from Europe, particularly from the Netherlands and the UK, but elsewhere in Europe over many years. and continues to receive people, particularly from Germany and other places who have houses in South Africa. So it continues to be a migrant destination for people from there. More recently, historically and more recently, it has also been a destination for people coming from various parts of Asia. So there is a large citizen population that is South Asian, Indian, Pakistani, or Bangladeshi, who live there and have lived there for generations. But there are new generations or new waves of Bangladeshis, Pakistani, Indian, also Chinese, and other migrants who have come and are working or trying to work in the country. The vast majority, however, of people coming into the country do so from Africa, and about 85% of those come from the SADC region, from Southern Africa, the largest number coming from Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Malawi, very neighboring countries, but there are also significant and visible populations who've come from Somalia, from Nigeria, and elsewhere in the continent. So all of this sort of converging on South Africa, as you can see from those arrows, and in some ways transforming the country. The country now has about 55 million people in total, and about 5 or maybe 5% of those are international migrants of all of these various kinds, the majority of them being from the African continent. They are moving into what is famously one of the most unequal countries on earth. There's been a kind of ongoing competition with Brazil as to which country is most unequal. And in some ways, it doesn't matter which one is the most. They're both extraordinarily unequal, with, as you can see in this kind of illustrative picture from Time magazine, with the sort of wealthy areas very closely connected to very poor areas. So you have spaces like this, which is Dainfern, a neighborhood in Johannesburg, which has a lot of foreigners in it, but wealthy foreigners. The second foreign language spoken here is German. So it is a wealthy area with, you can see, enormous numbers of swimming pools, large gardens, etc., which draws very heavily on labor and laborers from places like Diepsloot, which is less than 5 kilometers away. So a lot of labor is moving from there. And it's places like Diepsloot, which is where most immigrants are going. And it's places like this where much of the violence has been taking place. And so I just want to spend a minute talking about what these places are. These are townships, but they're not highly stable townships. They're not communities often that have been there for years. In fact, Diepsloot 20 years ago was literally an empty field. It was a place that was used for farming, and it was meant to be in a kind of emergency location for people resettled from near a river. People who were being displaced by floods were put here temporarily until other sorts of housing could be found for them. In the next 10 years, it turned into this. And you can see this transformation happening very, very rapidly. So many of those original population are still there, but they've been joined by people from all over South Africa, Mozambique, Pakistan, all of those countries that I mentioned before, in what has become an area that now has 100, 150, maybe 200,000 people. Importantly, it was only after this had been growing for about 15, 20 years that a police station moved in. So this was an area where the police, in fact, were often afraid to go. This was an area that was de facto self-regulating, self-governing, a kind of do-it-yourself urbanism, where while the state might come in and provide some electricity or basic services, the governance of this space was essentially done by the people themselves. There were party offices, but no one to enforce policy, no one to do anything of that sort. And it is these sorts of spaces which are highly contested, highly diverse, and often highly sort of transient, in which a lot of the violence has been taking place. For the people living there, things are tough, and you can understand that the violence is coming not in some automatic sort of mechanistic way, but is very much rooted in the fact that people are coming to these spaces looking to build a future. And indeed, South Africans were promised in 1994 that the government and others would work with them to overcome the legacies of apartheid, to overcome poverty, to overcome inequality. And that for some has worked, but for many, they've gone nowhere, right? So the government has built or claims to have built what they call housing opportunities. So 4 million people, 4 million households either being given a house or a space to build a house with services since 1994. An extraordinary sort of initiative, but many of these houses are being built in areas that are far from any kind of employment. So you have to make a choice of having a house or having the potential to get a job. And as a result, huge numbers of people continue to be without homes. What we have seen is that the number of absolutely poor people has gone down from about 34% in 1996 to only 19%, but that is still an enormous number. And that decline is based largely on massive social grants, direct cash distributions to people who are disabled, who are poor, who are elderly, which has stopped people from starving, but has not provided jobs or sustainable futures. Indeed, the GDP per capita has been stagnant, or depending on how you read it, is actually negative. That the economic growth over the last 20 years has not kept pace with the population growth. So on aggregate, people are actually, many of them getting poorer. And you can see that the numbers, the unemployment numbers are really extraordinary, right? So in early 2019, which is the last statistics I could find, almost a third, 27, between a quarter and a third of people were unemployed. But if you look at that among youth, who are the ones most involved in kind of instances of violence, that numbers goes up to above 50%. And if you take out white and Indian youth from that, so you're looking at the Black population, the number climbs to almost 60%, right? So you have a massive growth of cities, a lot of people coming in, a very young population with very few prospects for jobs, very few prospects to build a future, right? And these prospects in the last year or so have even gotten worse through COVID, right? So what we're looking at is exactly what you would expect, right? Inequality has grown. Murder and sexual violence rates are rising after declining for a number of years. And importantly, from my argument here, even though people are upset, even though they are poor, they are not mobilizing in kind of traditional political ways. What you see is voting rates are actually declining, a kind of frustration with national politics, a sense that the government of the ANC and other national parties has forgotten them. And so voting doesn't matter. But instead, what you see is much more sort of angry and violent forms of protest, strikes, civil protests, marches, which are meant to attract resources, but also really about just demonstrating anger and trying to mobilize populations locally in many ways to solve their own problems. Right? So that is the sort of general modality of how people are taking politics forward. And then there is the question of why does this often take the form of violence, and why does it take the form of violence against foreigners? And I think to understand that well, you have to look back a little bit at what's happened over the last few years, right? So just as a way of providing a framework, right? Let me just say that what we saw in 2008, which was the first kind of big violence, post-apartheid violence, you had 63 people who were killed. But what we've seen is actually fairly consistent, about 100 people being killed since then in what might be called xenophobic violence, which is a small number considering that South Africa murders about 50,000 people per year. But still, tens of thousands of people are being displaced. And about a third of those are South Africans who are not from a local place. So often of a different ethnic group, or maybe who have moved into a community and are conflicting with the people who are already there. Much of that violence in the early 2000s was focused in Johannesburg and Cape Town, but what we've started to see is a diversification of that violence. It's still typically happening in township areas, although there's been some in more agricultural areas, and it's happening around or on the edges of cities, very much in those sorts of areas like Diepsloot, which have been transformed through migration, who've been transformed by and diversified, where you have populations coming from many different places who are converging in areas where you have weak social and political institutions. The result has been sometimes very dramatic violence. And this is where those nasty images I was talking about come in, right? Including in 2008, the murder of Ernesto Alphabeto, a Mozambican man who was burnt alive in front of a big crowd. And as you can see, with the policemen watching, who arrived too late to do anything. So that was 2008. And that was the sort of quintessential attacks which really put this on the agenda. And it resulted in the displacement of about 100,000 people, some of whom were put in refugee camps set up by the UNHCR, where they stayed for sort of 6 or 7 months, right? Millions of rand worth of property were burned, shops displaced, families also displaced and destroyed. There was claims, of course, that this would never happen again. But like many of those claims from politicians and much of the condemnation, nothing happened, right? And again, you saw in 2010 and here in 2015, this was the murder of another Mozambican man, this in Alexandra, just outside of, or just next to the richest part of Johannesburg. And this done right in front of a photographer who was in his car and was afraid to get out in front of these groups, but still documented. Even though the faces of these people are very clearly visible, as far as I know, none have been convicted and almost none were even arrested, right? So this was a public act of murder against him because he was Mozambican, or at least in part because he was Mozambican, that was done to send a message to politicians and to send a message to other foreigners in the area, right? We've seen this sort of violence happen again and again. So this is from August last year in Soweto, where violence against shopkeepers continued and set off a sort of string of attacks that happened. Again, the police come in, they don't do arrests, they don't stop people. They often offer to help protect foreigners by removing them, their people, their bodies from the area, which more or less leaves the shops open for looting, right? Again, protests, this was happening at about the same time in downtown, where a group of people left from Mamelodi, marched into downtown Pretoria to protest immigrants in their community, to protest crime, to protest other issues, and then went back to Mamelodi and subsequently looted many of the foreign shops that were there. And these are images from last week. This is an attack done by the MK, the Umkhonto wa Sizwe, which was the sort of ANC's armed wing, veterans, or people at least claiming to be veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle, who led attacks on foreign shopkeepers in Durban, right? So this is something that is ongoing. It is something that is diversifying, and it is something that is happening in very particular kinds of places. But that doesn't tell, just the fact that it's occurring doesn't really tell us why. But I think if we look at this quote from one of the leaders of the MK Veterans Association, we start to see part of what's going on here. And this is why I make the argument that it is a resurgent kind of citizenship. Not one that I would support or one I like, but it is an effort by South Africans to mobilize and to try to take control for themselves of a life that they feel that they've lost, a future that they feel that has not been delivered. And some of that goes back into the ways in which foreigners and immigrations have been taking place, discussed over the last few years, last 20 years or even longer. But some of it also goes back into the way in which townships have been governed. So when we start to look at explanations in a kind of deeper, granular way, we have to understand that at a national level, we have a government that refuses to admit that there is xenophobia, but has instead said that this sort of violence, which is so clearly symbolic and targeted, is in fact just ordinary crime. It is just coincidental. They run shops in the townships, so of course, occasionally they get attacked. But if you speak to the perpetrators, if you study what is happening on the ground, it is very clear that there is something else that is going on here, that people understand what they are doing in ways that are not just about getting food for tomorrow, about getting resources, but are about sending political messages, are about making certain types of claims on their futures, right? And you can see them echo the language of officials that they've heard for the last 20 years, right? So here, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who is the first Minister of Home Affairs, but had for many years been the leader, until very recently, of the Inkatha Freedom Party, who in his first speech to Parliament basically made it very clear that if immigrants continued to come, South Africa's transformation, its positive efforts to try to address poverty and inequality would fail. And you've seen that kind of rhetoric across the political spectrum, not universally, but regularly. Whenever something bad is going on, whenever there are issues, politicians hinting that the problem is an invasion from outside, usually in the form of Nigerians or Zimbabweans or others who have come in, sometimes with an argument that they are working on behalf of people who want to undermine South Africa's credibility and legitimacy, but some who just say they are criminals or they're part of criminal networks. You've seen this now become more and more common. So those were sort of outlier comments in the 1990s and early 2000s, but you've started to see that kind of rhetoric at a national level become part of how politics is framed, part of how politicians who have not been able to transform South Africa for the last 20 years have started to scapegoat, have started to turn attention away from the failings of themselves or even inter-party competition, and have started to put the blame most firmly on foreigners. So here, King Goodwill Zwelithini, who is a traditional leader of the Zulu people, making this kind of statement in 2015, which echoes some of the political statements that you heard during the Rwandan genocide. And it's not surprising that soon after, a number of people were attacked and thousands of people displaced from across KwaZulu-Natal, and then again in Johannesburg, where Zulu-run sort of managed hostels or dormitories then spilled out onto the street to attack foreigners. This is again a speech that we heard just last year, right? Where we talk about foreigners as threats, right? And again, closely connected, a statement that is made and almost immediately followed by violence across townships. What we're starting to see now, in advance of the local government elections taking place next year, for the first time are whole parties or political movements that are taking shape, which are anti-immigrant. So South Africa First is now a new party, and for the first time is pretty much a single issue party, which is about making jobs for South Africans, but by making jobs by ensuring that there are no more foreigners allowed in. It's not clear what kind of popular support the party has, but they get a lot of traction on social media. There is a lot of sort of discussions around that. There is a whole campaign under this Ularato Pillay Twitter handle, where there's tens of thousands of people every day commenting on the need to purge the country of foreigners. And even Cyril Ramaphosa, who is generally quite a pragmatic, modest man, has adopted some of this language as a way of framing the challenges that South Africa has ahead. So this gives the impression that this is really something that is led from the top, but I think we have to understand that it is also something that actually the leaders at the top are learning from people on the ground. The people on the ground, however, are using that language as a way of mobilizing around very specific issues. And so here we can start to see a quote from Sipho Zungu, who's part of a leader of the All Truck Drivers Foundation. And what they've done over the last year is attack hundreds of lorries, of big trucks coming in from the port, primarily in Durban, and going up towards Johannesburg or Zimbabwe or Malawi. And they've burnt those trucks, most driven by foreign truck drivers, but many driven by South Africans, as a way to send a message to truck drivers, that to the owners of these trucks, that South Africans should be given preference, as you see here, but really that these businesses should be owned by them. And when they say them, it's not South Africans generally. It is these kind of consortium or kind of cartels, which take the form of unions, but often, like the taxi drivers in South Africa, are really forms of localized kind of gangsterism. They're sort of mafias who want to take control of certain sectors and use the language of transformation and use the language of of immigration and xenophobia as a way to justify pushing out competition. And this is a model that we see across both the economic and the political spectrum. Right? You see this again in the language of the people who are mobilizing on the ground, and these are quotations from 2008, but you would see this kind of language over and over again. This is not just criminality. This is people who are mobilizing in the name of their country or in the name of their community, but they don't do so spontaneously. They do so as part of social movements, often very locally led, who by leaders who are trying to assert their own authority, not at a national level, but usually over part of one of these townships, one of these areas that is highly transformatory, where there are not existing social institutions, where political contestation is rife, and part of how people are mobilizing at that local level is through anti-immigration kind of gangsterism, right? It is local sorts of leaders leading this, whether they are coming out of the economic spectrum, whether they are a shopkeepers association, or whether they are political leaders. And I just want to give you a couple examples of what this looks like in sort of politics. So this is research we've done in Jeffsville, which is just outside of Pretoria in a township called Attridgeville. But again, on the edge of an established township, a part which was settled relatively recently and was settled, unsurprisingly, by a man named Jeff, was one of the first people in, who then named the area after him. He had worked with the ANC, but had sort of fallen out with them and was trying to build up his local authority in this area so that he could be in charge, that people who came into the area would need to work with him, and that he could take sort of taxes and other sorts of benefits from the people around them. So what he's done in 2008 and multiple times since then is basically use the language of transformation, recognize that people don't have houses, that they are frustrated, and said, if you support me, I will get you a house. I will get you resources. And to do that, he chased the foreigners out of the community and redistributed those houses to his supporters. For some, he then charged the foreigners to come back in, which also gave him resources. So the result of this, which was not about purging the country, he didn't really care where they went. They just had to leave there, and they had to leave their houses so that he could give them to his supporters. And the result was that he is still there. He runs this area basically as his own little fiefdom, his own little principality, in which he controls who can come in, and in which he collects the money for businesses that take place, parts of the rents. He assigns housing. He is the one who regulates this. The ANC is not present. The national government is not present. And the police do not come to arrest those who've been behind the violence. Instead, they are working with him and saying, look, as long as you keep the peace, you can stay in charge. And he keeps the peace by basically running a protection racket. Right? We've seen this again much more recently in Philani, which is just outside of Durban, but again in an area that has been settled relatively recently and has immigrants from not only the Durban area, but the Eastern Cape and then elsewhere on the continent. And again, using that language of transformation, of Black economic empowerment, of getting people jobs, getting people businesses, getting people a future. A local business forum, which no one had heard of a few years ago, went and actually kidnapped foreigners and then ransomed them, got money from the state, got money from other foreigners, and built their authority within the area to say, look, we are the ones who control this space. If you want to come in here, you have to work with us, right? And ironically, they are now, because they released the foreigners, they negotiated with the state to say, if you pay us, we will be peacemakers. And they now have a contract under this kind of national action plan to basically be community mediators in the area. They've established themselves as the leadership who can keep the peace, right? And in the classic way of the mafia, they've created a problem which they can then help solve. And if you want to work in that area, you have to work with them. Otherwise, that problem comes back, right? So they extract resources from the foreigners who want to live there. They extract resources from the state. And in the process, they have established their dominance over this area. So in conclusion, what do we make of all of this? Well, of course it's depressing. Of course it's frustrating. There are direct human rights issues for people, but I think there's something more fundamental and something that becomes even more dangerous as we enter a period of competitive politics with the local government elections coming up, with increased hardship as a result of economic decline furthered by COVID, is the fact that South African politics at this local level, and as you saw on that map, this is not just one or two places, this is all over the country, and people are increasingly using this language of exclusion against foreigners, but also against other South Africans, as a way to build their local authority, their local power. They do so in ways that are not dictated by the Constitution, of course. They do so in ways that are not even governed by the police, unless those police are corrupt and working with these people. And they do so in ways which ration rights to space, to jobs, based on local criteria about who belongs, right? And so it is a kind of reassertion of South Africanness. It is a reassertion of people trying to get their rights, to try to further the transformation that they thought was going to be delivered, but is being done in ways that is essentially creating a patchwork of governance systems across the country in what we have started calling a kind of indirect rule, where the government has no interest in going into these areas because they then have to solve the problems. Instead, they have stood back and said, as long as there's no more violence, you can continue to govern these areas as you see fit. And I think that raises enormous challenges for whatever kind of problems or issues we'd hope to address in the future, not just xenophobia. So let me end there, and hopefully that's enough for us to have a good discussion. So I'll stop sharing the screen and hopefully can see some of you.
Thank you very much, Loren, for that very interesting and detailed discussion of the situation in South Africa. For the participants, if you have any question that you want to ask to Loren, or if you have a comment, then please drop them down in the chat box or in the Q&A box. While I wait for some questions to come in, I would already like to maybe ask you, Loren, you've very convincingly argued about what you think are the main drivers or the main factors that explain this xenophobic violence and anti-immigration feelings. Could you maybe also very quickly specify at what level you think action could be undertaken to address this, and in particular, considering the public that we have here, what kind of action can international civil society organizations or donors do to support South Africa? Is it more about putting pressure for changing political modes of governance? Is it about economic measures? Do such actions as working more on media and how communication, what level do you think of action could be useful?
It's a great question, and obviously there are many different things that need to be done. Much of what's been done around ironically, much of what's been done around questions of xenophobia has in our research actually, or at least potentially, made things worse. So what you've had is a lot of public awareness and public education campaigns, which have really brought the issue of immigration made it even more a discussion point, and in some ways has heightened the sense that foreign intervention is coming in on behalf of foreigners, which means there are people there who care about them and who will give us money if we attack them, right? And so has made them even more a symbolic kind of resource. And some of the violence I was just describing in Durban was very clearly aimed at extracting resources from the government, but also some of these kind of international organizations to come in and do peacekeeping and to give them resources. The public education campaigns we see no evidence that they're working. Instead, what we've seen is the real challenge is about trying to transform these governance systems, right? And some of that is just about holding people accountable. If you build your political career on killing people or attacking or threatening or stealing their property, and you're left to stay in office, of course, that is going to be the mode in which you continue to rule. And that's been what's happening. And so in some ways, until you can address that issue, that politicians are building legitimacy and building power through violence, this sort of thing is going to continue to happen, whether it's against foreigners or against some other group. Right? I think there does also have to be an effort at the national level to really try to hold politicians accountable for the kind of political framing that they're doing. Because as you saw, there was this deep resonance between what is being said on the ground and what is being said at the national level. And when you have politicians like the president or kings or traditional leaders basically endorsing this kind of violence, it makes it all the more likely and all the more possible. But I think the fundamental issue is really looking at how townships are governed. And ironically, even in South Africa, very little research is done on these local governance systems. Much of the focus has been on national policy and the way in which it is implemented, but without really understanding the logic of this highly localized governance and the way in which violence, protest, displacement is actually connected, not just to economic frustration, but to the way in which these places are being ruled.
Thank you. Now I see that related to that, someone asked a question, but I'm not sure if it's very specific, so I'm not sure you'll be able to answer. Say, like, what can Belgium do to coerce the South African mafia, and even more, what does Belgium do? I'm not sure if you have insight specifically into how Belgium as a donor or partner is acting on this.
That I don't know. I mean, a lot of the funding for discussions around racism and xenophobia has come from the European Union and through those sorts of programs or through private foundations. USAID, the Americans, have been very visible on this through Freedom House and others through the IOM or through UNHCR, which I suppose Belgium supports, but it's indirectly. I haven't seen Belgian activities per se, but I think any sort of effort to promote government accountability and local government reform can be very positive. I'm not sure what Belgium's sort of current programs in South Africa or the region are, but I think what we don't need is more discussions around immigration and immigration policy. Those are needed, but they're not going to address this issue.
Yes, which makes me wonder to what extent is our own ways in Europe of dealing with the immigrant issue, how does that influence the relations that we have with South Africa and how we're dealing with or responding to these developments in South Africa? Because I know it has a clear influence in like relations with countries like Mali, but I'm not so sure with South Africa if it's as evident.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways in which the EU's current response to immigrants, particularly to African immigrants, has shaped what's happening in South Africa. I mean, one, there has been some direct efforts from Angela Merkel and Ramaphosa had meetings about what to do with African migrants. And Germany was very keen on South Africa trying to welcome more, to try to create a sort of southern pole that would distract people or redirect them from going north. And of course, huge numbers already are doing that, right? It's cheaper, it's easier to go across land than to try to cross the Mediterranean, particularly from East Africa or from the Horn. But I think there's a second way in which there's been a kind of unfortunate, sort of more symbolic conversation. And so as the European Union has become harder and harder on African migrants and invested enormously in patrolling the Mediterranean and trying to stop Africans from moving, they've lost the kind of moral authority to push South Africa to take a different approach. So South Africa then adopts similar policies to what the US or the EU does and says, look, this is what modern wealthy countries do. And it's very difficult for anybody to critique them for that because it is true. That is what these countries are doing. And the EU in turn has looked at South Africa as an example to justify their own exclusion, to say, people say we're racist, But it's not only us who are afraid of mass African migration. Look, even South Africa is afraid of this. Even South Africa can't handle people coming. So there is a kind of mutually reinforcing dialogue, I think, going on between Europe and South Africa.
Interesting. There is another question that's being asked, and that is, would you qualify white farmer killings also as a part of xenophobia problem?
That's a really interesting question, and one we've debated, because there's often a question, if this is really xenophobia and not just criminality, why are they not attacking white people who are really often the wealthiest immigrants and the ones with whom they have a historical issue? I would see that again. Some of the white farmer killings they're a complicated and deeply historical kind of a phenomenon. Some, I think, have to do with questions of just mass exploitation and particular farmers who are disliked for the treatment of labor and others. And this is a way of asserting a control, but the language or a kind of justice, but the language around some of the killings of white farmers is very similar. In the sense, I don't know if you'd call it xenophobia, but it is still rooted in the sense of the failed transformation, that South Africans were promised something that they have not got. And whether it's foreigners or white farmers who still own a lot of the agricultural land, they're identified as part of the problem. And until we get rid of that group, we cannot see the fruits of freedom. We cannot see the transformation we are promised. And so I don't know that that's what motivates the individuals who are killing the foreigners or killing the farmers, sorry, but it's clearly part of the language.
Okay. And then another question is the denial by the South African government to call xenophobia by its name likely to change? And if so, how?
That's a great question, because how can you have a national action plan against racism and xenophobia and not think you have a problem with xenophobia? And we've been surprised at the reluctance by the government to not call it this. We don't know what is at stake, right? What is the problem with calling it xenophobia? And what we've seen is, it's sort of a hypothesis, and others may have other explanations, is that they don't want to speak about poor Black South Africans as holding hate against foreigners. They don't want to delegitimize the local leadership at that local level that they depend on so heavily. And in some ways, they want to continue to frame this as crime only that is rooted in inequalities that are inherited from apartheid, that are still linked to the failure of redistribution, the failure of basically the white elite to share the wealth. And so it is very important to continue this narrative that this is crime, and this is crime that is rooted in racialized inequality. And to take nothing away from the fact that there is a lot of crime that is rooted in inequality, and the inequality is unacceptably acute. There is a narrative that the government is pushing that I think makes it very difficult for them to look both at the kind of governance systems that they're supporting and the kind of rhetoric that surrounds them.
Diving in a bit more into that, I always wonder, what is really the right way or the right word to use to describe this type of violence? Because obviously the way the government does it about describing it, it's just criminality, is not correct. It doesn't reflect the driver of that violence, but neither does really the notion of xenophobic violence, because that creates the idea in the head that it is just about hatred of other for the sake of it. While, as you explain, there's many more things behind it. It is an anger not so much about the otherness of people, but about misgovernment, about economic inequality. So to what extent is talking about xenophobic violence also a useful qualifier?
Yeah,
I know it's a bit controversial to say that, but
no, I mean, there's been a lot of debates around also, is this Afrophobia as opposed to xenophobia, because most of the people are being who are attacked are Africans, and that's somehow linked to the Bantu or the apartheid education, which inculcated an idea that people from the rest of the continent were backwards or dangerous. I'm not sure which is the right term to use. Xenophobia in some ways gets at, you're right, it gets at the sense of that it's not just fear, but it recognizes that it is something that is mobilized against outsiders. And those outsiders can be constructed in many ways. As I've said, it's often about immigrants, but about a third of the time, it's also about South Africans who come from the wrong place, who are being used as a political resource in something else. But to be fair, whether we talk about anti-Semitism, whether we talk about xenophobia, whether we talk about racism, part of it is rooted in a sort of individual psychology and attitude. But when it manifests itself, it's always manifested for a reason, to try to achieve some kind of political or social goal. And so in that sense, I think xenophobia in that way is no more inappropriate to call this xenophobia than to call Donald Trump racist, because he's using race and racial categories as a way to further a political agenda.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question is, are there any continuities or differences within the literature on how this violence is conceptualized and what precipitated these changes, particularly before and after 1994?
Yeah, I mean, there's very surprisingly little literature on the xenophobic violence at all, and surprisingly little on the kind of sociology of violence in the townships. There's a lot of kind of criminological accounts, but even there, not a lot on what's really going on. That said, I think there's been two kinds of connections that are made to the pre-1994 period. The first is really about how immigrants are perceived and outsiders are perceived. And there's a recognition that the migrant labor system was something that was used by the apartheid government to undermine Black South African economic and political power. So by bringing in temporary labor from Zimbabwe, Malawi, what was then Rhodesia, it stopped them having to give resources to Black South Africans, and it enabled them to send people back before they could mobilize, unionize, and push for change. So there is still a legacy of the sense that foreigners are in the country with the idea that they're working for the white government, or they're working for somebody to undermine Black South Africans. So there is a kind of discursive continuity. Perhaps more importantly, there are people who are starting to make connections between the kind of township governance that happened, especially during the anti-apartheid struggle, with the civics, with the hostels, and some of the violence you saw between the ANC and the IFP or other political parties, and the kind of political authority structures that established at a local level. And in some instances, the people leading the violence against foreigners were the same ones who were leading violence in the name of fighting apartheid. So there are these kind of local leaders whose authority and power has been rooted in violence for decades. And if it's not the individuals, it's the organizations and the structures they helped create in the 80s that continue to rule some of these places through violence and fear.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. And myself working more on conflict situations, which are obviously very different from South Africa. But there's this common element of once a country has a long experience of governing through violence, it is extremely hard to move away from that form of politics. And I can imagine that in South Africa, it dates from the anti-apartheid struggle, but also the apartheid regime itself, which governed through violence. So do you see any prospect really for these kind of mindsets to change if they are so deeply embedded in how people are used to govern and are used in being governed and therefore responding to the people who are controlling them or who are governing them?
Right. I mean, usually you try to convert people from, using violence to other forms of governing through providing them incentives, providing them opportunities that make violence look less attractive. And unfortunately, given the economic situation, it's hard to offer those kind of opportunities. I do think there are ways in which, police reform, criminal justice, other things that hold local leaders accountable. The court system is weak and problematic, but is still there. And that could be used to try to shift people's incentives, right? These local leaders, like people who use violence elsewhere, are maybe amoral, but they're not irrational, right? They know that this works for them. And what we need to do is figure out how to create a system where that doesn't work for them, and where the political parties see an incentive to mobilize people peacefully on the ground. And maybe more competitive local politics will do that. But again, you have to have a way of offering people something for them to follow you. And right now, there's not a lot of resources to go around.
Yes. And then the final question is, should we get more worried that with the so-called MK veterans joining in anti-foreigner attacks, the attacks might be more orchestrated and widespread?
That's a great question. I don't know a lot about how the MK the Veterans Association has organized. Obviously, in Zimbabwe, we saw, the sort of struggle veterans taking on a very real and kind of national role in the crisis there. My sense is the MK veterans are quite, in some ways, disorganized. And so perhaps we don't have to worry too much, but I think that is something, if it's not the MK veterans, it's these other kind of parties, it's the use of social media, it's other kind of efforts that might, I don't think, create a national organization against foreigners, but certainly help to link these disparate groups in ways that could be quite dangerous.
Thank you very much. If no one else in the public has any last questions, I see one person just dropped the word hello, and I'm not sure if there are, if there is anything more that is meant to follow. But if not, I would like to thank you, Loren, very much for taking the time for talking to us, for shining the light on the situation in South Africa and answering the questions that we have. Thank you very much also to all the participants for joining us today. Now, our next Africa Lunch meeting will take place on the 1st of December, and it will be on the politics of DDR in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If you are not already signed up through our website, please do so if you're interested in receiving further invitations for the Africa Lunch meeting, or you can also follow us on our Twitter account. So thank you very much again, Loren. And hopefully I will see some of the participants next time for our next Africa Lunch meeting again. Thank you, bye.